At 2:13 in the morning, a man named Daniel Harper stood barefoot in the middle of his kitchen, whispering into a 911 phone call that would later disturb an entire country. His voice trembled as he told dispatchers that his wife, Emily, had disappeared sometime during the night. He said he woke up and found the back door unlocked. Her purse was still inside the house. Her phone sat charging beside the bed. Her car remained parked in the driveway with the keys still hanging near the front entrance. Nothing about the scene made sense. A mother of two had vanished without taking a single thing with her, and according to Daniel, there was absolutely no reason for her to leave. But when officers arrived at the quiet suburban home just outside Columbus, Ohio, something about Daniel's story felt carefully rehearsed. He cried at the right moments. He repeated the same phrases over and over. And while he claimed he had spent the entire night searching for his wife, detectives noticed his shoes were completely clean despite the heavy rainstorm that had soaked the neighborhood for hours. Within days, Emily Harper's disappearance exploded across national headlines. Neighbors described the couple as warm, successful, and deeply devoted to their children. Friends said Emily loved photography, gardening, and late-night movie marathons with her husband. Their social media pages painted the image of a nearly perfect American family. Smiling vacation photos, birthday celebrations, weekend barbecues. Everything looked normal. Yet investigators quickly uncovered tiny details that began pulling that perfect image apart piece by piece. Detectives discovered Daniel had waited nearly 40 minutes before calling police. Security cameras from a nearby gas station captured his truck driving through town around 1:07 a.m., even though he insisted he never left the house that night. Then came the discovery that changed the entire direction of the investigation. During a second search of the Harper home, investigators noticed a section of basement flooring that looked newer than the rest. The concrete had dried unevenly, and according to construction records, no repairs had ever been scheduled for that property. As rumors spread, the town became consumed by questions nobody could answer. Why would a husband lie during the first hours of his wife's disappearance? Why did neighbors report hearing what sounded like a violent argument only hours before Emily vanished? And why did Daniel continue giving television interviews while refusing to answer direct questions from investigators? What police would eventually uncover beneath that basement floor would become one of the most disturbing discoveries the community had ever seen, exposing secrets, betrayal, and a hidden double life nobody saw coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the third day of Emily Harper's disappearance, the quiet town outside Columbus no longer felt safe. News vans lined the streets from sunrise to midnight, while neighbors stood in small groups along sidewalks, trying to make sense of a story that seemed to grow stranger every hour. Detectives retraced Daniel Harper's movements repeatedly, building a timeline that immediately raised concerns. According to Daniel, he and Emily had dinner together around 8:30 that evening before watching television upstairs. He claimed Emily went to bed shortly after 10 p.m. while he stayed awake in the living room scrolling through his phone. Around midnight, he told investigators he checked on her and noticed she was no longer in bed. At first, he assumed she stepped outside to clear her head after a small disagreement they had earlier in the evening. But nearly 2 hours passed before he finally called 911. Detectives found that delay difficult to ignore. As investigators spoke with people close to the couple, a very different image of their marriage began to emerge. Emily's closest friend revealed the couple had argued constantly over the past 6 months, mostly about money and Daniel's increasingly secretive behavior. Another friend admitted Emily recently confided that she felt uncomfortable in her own home, though she never explained why. Then detectives discovered Emily had searched online for divorce attorneys only days before she vanished. Daniel insisted their marriage was stable and claimed the searches meant nothing, but detectives noticed his explanations changed slightly every time he repeated the story. Small details shifted. Certain timelines no longer matched. And while Daniel appeared calm during television interviews, officers privately noted how unusually controlled he remained during questioning. Even after his wife disappeared, he never once asked investigators if they believed she was still alive. The deeper police looked into Daniel Harper, the more unsettling the timeline became. traffic cameras captured his truck driving toward an industrial area nearly 20 minutes from his home during the early morning hours, despite his earlier statement that he never left the neighborhood. When confronted, Daniel changed his story and claimed he drove around searching for Emily after panicking. But detectives found no evidence he contacted friends, family members, hospitals, or emergency services during that time. Then another witness came forward. A neighbor reported hearing what sounded like furniture dragging across the Harper basement floor shortly after midnight, followed by what she described as a loud crashing sound. Investigators returned to the home once again, focusing heavily on the basement where they had already noticed the suspicious patch of newer concrete. What they still did not realize was that the single most important clue in the entire case had been sitting inside that house from the very beginning. Long before her name appeared across national headlines, Emily Harper was known as the kind of person who remembered birthdays, checked on friends without being asked, and made every room feel warmer the moment she walked into it. She grew up in a quiet neighborhood outside Dayton, Ohio, raised by two school teachers who described her as deeply creative and unusually compassionate from a young age. Family members said she carried a camera with her almost everywhere as a teenager, documenting road trips, holidays, and ordinary moments most people overlooked. After college, Emily worked as a freelance photographer while balancing life as a mother of two children she adored more than anything else. Friends remembered how she talked constantly about wanting to open a small photography studio someday, somewhere peaceful where families could preserve memories together. To people around her, Emily seemed genuinely happy. Her social media pages showed weekend camping trips, birthday dinners, and smiling family photos taken inside the very house investigators would later seal off as a crime scene. But as detectives slowly uncovered more about her private life, they realized those images only told part of the story. Behind closed doors, cracks had already begun to form. Emily first met Daniel Harper during a mutual friend's 4th of July party nearly 12 years earlier. Friends described Daniel as confident, charming, and intensely attentive during the early years of their relationship. He worked in property management and often spoke about building a stable future for a family of his own. For years, their marriage appeared solid from the outside. They bought a home together, raised children together, and became familiar faces in their community. But over time, people close to Emily began noticing subtle changes in her behavior. She became quieter during gatherings. She stopped posting as frequently online. She occasionally canceled plans at the last minute without explanation. One of her closest friends later told investigators that Emily had become increasingly anxious around Daniel, carefully watching her words whenever he entered the room. Detectives would eventually uncover private messages Emily sent just weeks before she disappeared, messages that painted a far different picture than the happy family seen online. In one conversation, Emily admitted she no longer trusted her husband financially after discovering hidden credit card debt and unexplained withdrawals from their joint account. In another message, she described Daniel as controlling, claiming he monitored her phone calls and questioned her constantly about where she went during the day. As investigators dug deeper into Daniel's recent behavior, even more troubling details emerged. Financial records showed the Harpers were under serious pressure despite appearing comfortable publicly. Credit cards had nearly reached their limits. Mortgage payments had recently been delayed. Detectives also learned Daniel had secretly taken out a life insurance policy on Emily less than 4 months before she vanished. When questioned about it later, he claimed it was simply part of responsible financial planning. But investigators found additional purchases that raised even more concern. Security footage showed Daniel visiting a hardware store just days before Emily disappeared, where he purchased industrial cleaning supplies, heavy-duty plastic sheeting, gloves, and several bags of quick-dry concrete. At the time, those purchases seemed ordinary enough. Yet combined with the suspicious basement flooring discovered later, detectives began seeing a far more disturbing pattern emerge. Then investigators uncovered internet searches made from Daniel's home computer late at night while Emily was asleep. Searches involving concrete drying times, missing person investigations, and how long forensic evidence could remain hidden beneath newly poured cement. Still, one detail continued haunting detectives more than anything else. Just 48 hours before Emily disappeared, a neighbor reported seeing her standing alone outside the house, crying inside her car for nearly an hour. Nobody knew what caused that moment. Nobody understood what happened after she went back inside. And the truth behind that final evening would remain hidden until much later. At first, nothing about the evening of October 14th seemed unusual. According to Daniel Harper, the night unfolded like dozens before it. He told investigators the family ate dinner together shortly after 7, helped the children finish homework, and spent the rest of the evening quietly at home. Phone records later confirmed Emily exchanged text messages with a friend around 8:42 p.m., casually discussing plans for the following weekend. Nothing in those messages suggested fear or panic. At 9:18 p.m., a neighbor walking his dog reported seeing lights on inside the Harper basement while Daniel stood alone in the driveway, speaking on his phone. Investigators would later discover Daniel deleted several calls from his phone history made during that exact time period. Around 10:03 p.m., Emily posted a photograph online showing the family dog asleep near the fireplace. It would become the final confirmed sign that she was alive inside the house. After that moment, the timeline began collapsing into contradictions. Daniel claimed Emily went upstairs around 10:30 while he remained downstairs watching television. But data recovered from Emily's smartwatch showed rapid movement throughout the house nearly 40 minutes later, followed by an abrupt loss of signal just after 11:17 p.m. Detectives soon realized the most important moments of that night had never been captured inside the Harper home itself, but outside it. A neighbor's security camera facing the street recorded partial footage investigators initially overlooked during the first days of the search. At 12:11 a.m., Daniel's truck appeared briefly at the end of the driveway before reversing back toward the garage. Nearly 20 minutes later, the same truck was captured leaving the neighborhood entirely without headlights. Daniel never mentioned this movement during his first police interview. When investigators confronted him, he insisted he drove around searching for Emily after noticing she was missing. But another detail immediately raised suspicion. The truck returned home at 1:04 a.m., yet Daniel did not call 911 until 2:13. During that missing hour, detectives could not verify a single thing Daniel did. Then another witness stepped forward claiming she heard shouting coming from inside the Harper home shortly before midnight. She described hearing a woman yell the words, "Please stop," followed by a loud crashing noise that suddenly cut off. Other neighbors reported hearing nothing at all. The uncertainty surrounding those final hours only deepened the mystery. As investigators reconstructed the night minute by minute, they began noticing strange physical details throughout the house itself. Furniture in the basement appeared slightly out of place compared to family photographs taken earlier that year. A section of rug near the basement stairs smelled heavily of cleaning chemicals despite appearing freshly washed. Detectives also noticed the family dog behaving unusually whenever officers approached the basement area, pacing nervously and refusing to go downstairs. During a second forensic search, investigators used chemical testing inside the basement and discovered several faint traces of blood that had been partially cleaned from the concrete floor. The stains were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Daniel insisted he had recently cut his hand while moving tools, but forensic analysts quickly determined the blood belonged to Emily. Detectives then focused their attention on the section of newer concrete they had already identified near the far corner of the basement. The material remained noticeably lighter than the surrounding floor despite Daniel claiming the repairs had been completed months earlier. As officers carefully examined the area, another disturbing detail emerged. Beneath a nearby workbench sat a pair of Emily's earrings coated with fine concrete dust. Daniel claimed he had never seen them before, but investigators were no longer listening to his explanations the same way. Then investigators noticed something underneath the basement floorboards. The moment investigators confirmed traces of Emily Harper's blood inside the basement, the case exploded into a national obsession. Every major news station across the country began covering the story around the clock. Television headlines questioned whether America was witnessing another seemingly perfect marriage hiding something terrible underneath the surface. Reporters camped outside the Harper home day and night, while helicopters circled above the neighborhood, broadcasting live footage of investigators carrying evidence boxes from the property. Online forums filled with theories from strangers analyzing Daniel Harper's interviews frame by frame, pointing out his unusual body language, his controlled tone, and the way he never referred to Emily in the present tense after the first few days. Search parties formed across wooded areas outside Columbus, while volunteers handed out missing person flyers bearing Emily's smiling photograph. Her parents appeared on morning television begging for answers, visibly exhausted after days without sleep. Her mother repeatedly told reporters she believed her daughter was still alive somewhere, clinging desperately to hope even as detectives privately feared the worst. Then, unexpectedly, investigators received a tip that briefly changed the entire direction of the case. A woman in Indiana contacted authorities claiming she saw someone resembling Emily Harper at a roadside motel nearly 200 miles away. Security footage appeared to show a woman with similar hair and clothing entering a convenience store late at night. For a short period, detectives considered the possibility that Emily may have staged her disappearance voluntarily. The media immediately seized on the theory. Some speculated Emily had escaped an unhappy marriage. Others believe she may have discovered Daniel's financial problems and fled before the situation worsened. Daniel himself leaned heavily into this explanation during interviews, repeatedly suggesting his wife had been emotionally overwhelmed in recent months. But within 48 hours, investigators identified the woman from the motel footage and confirmed she had no connection to the Harper case whatsoever. The false lead collapsed almost instantly, bringing detectives back to the same disturbing question they had been circling from the beginning. If Emily never left voluntarily, then what exactly happened inside that basement? As investigators intensified their focus on Daniel Harper, his story began changing in ways detectives could no longer ignore. During his first interview, Daniel claimed he and Emily argued only briefly on the night she disappeared. But recovered text messages told a different story entirely. Hours before Emily vanished, she sent a message to a friend saying she planned to confront Daniel about something unforgivable she had recently discovered. Detectives later uncovered evidence suggesting Daniel had secretly drained thousands of dollars from shared accounts while hiding major gambling debts Emily knew nothing about. Financial records also revealed Daniel faced possible fraud investigations connected to several failed property investments. Then forensic analysts recovered deleted internet searches from Daniel's laptop, made just days before Emily disappeared. Searches involving body decomposition beneath concrete. Police response times for missing spouses. How forensic luminol testing worked inside homes. And whether phone data could still be traced after devices were destroyed. Each discovery answered one question while creating another even more disturbing. Detectives now believe Daniel had motive, opportunity, and evidence tying him directly to the crime scene. What they still lacked was a body, a confession, or proof of exactly what happened that night. The pressure surrounding Daniel intensified once detectives brought him back in for another formal interrogation. For nearly 6 hours, investigators carefully challenged every version of his story while Daniel sat rigidly in his chair repeating many of the same phrases he had used from the beginning. Detectives had heard hundreds of lies before, but this one felt different. Daniel rarely became emotional unless conversations focused specifically on how others viewed him publicly. When investigators mentioned Emily's children, he remained strangely detached. But the moment detectives discussed media coverage, his breathing noticeably changed. At several points, long silences filled the interrogation room while investigators simply watched him. Daniel avoided eye contact whenever the timeline shifted toward the missing hour before his 911 call. He repeatedly rubbed his hands together whenever detectives mentioned the basement. Then his story changed again. This time, Daniel admitted he and Emily fought violently that night after she confronted him about hidden debts and what investigators later described as another deeply personal betrayal. Daniel claimed Emily stormed downstairs afterward while he remained upstairs alone. But detectives already knew that account could not be true. Emily's smartwatch data placed both of them moving through the basement area minutes before her signal disappeared completely. Investigators let the silence hang for several seconds before sliding a final photograph across the table. The image showed a microscopic fragment recovered from beneath the newly poured basement concrete. A fragment containing traces of Emily Harper's DNA mixed directly into the cement itself. Then investigators confronted him with one final piece of evidence. The surveillance footage from the industrial site became the turning point investigators had been waiting for. Although the video quality was poor, detectives could clearly identify Daniel Harper's truck entering the area shortly after midnight on the same night Emily disappeared. Minutes later, the footage captured Daniel struggling to move a large plastic-covered object into the back of the vehicle before driving away again toward his home. Prosecutors believe the recording destroyed the final pieces of Daniel's original story, but the deeper investigators looked into his life, the more complicated the case became. Financial analysts discovered Daniel was facing far more serious problems than anyone initially realized. Hidden accounts revealed tens of thousands of dollars in gambling debt tied to online sports betting sites and failed investment schemes he had concealed from Emily for years. Detectives also uncovered evidence that Daniel had forged financial documents using Emily's name to secure additional loans shortly before her disappearance. If Emily exposed him, investigators believed he could lose everything, including the house, his reputation, and possibly even custody of his children. But the financial pressure was only part of what investigators eventually uncovered. While reviewing deleted phone data recovered from Daniel's devices, detectives discovered months of secret communication with another woman living nearly 3 states away. The relationship had been hidden carefully, buried beneath fake contact names and encrypted messaging applications Daniel believed investigators would never access. In those conversations, Daniel described Emily as an obstacle, preventing him from starting over financially and emotionally. He spoke repeatedly about wanting a completely new life. Prosecutors later argued the affair revealed motive, while the financial fraud revealed desperation. Combined together, investigators believe they exposed something much darker than a sudden argument gone wrong. But Daniel continued insisting Emily's death had never been planned. During later interviews with his legal team, he claimed the confrontation inside the basement became physical after Emily threatened to report his fraud to authorities and leave him permanently. According to Daniel, she slipped during the struggle and struck her head against a metal storage shelf. He insisted her death was accidental and claimed panic drove every decision he made afterward. But detectives struggled to believe his explanation once forensic evidence showed signs of extensive cleanup efforts completed long before he ever contacted police. The purchases of concrete, industrial cleaning chemicals, gloves, and plastic sheeting had all occurred days before Emily vanished. To investigators, those details suggested preparation, not panic. The courtroom reactions became emotional the moment prosecutors revealed the full timeline publicly for the first time. Emily Harper's parents sat frozen as detectives described the evidence hidden beneath their daughter's own basement floor. Jurors listened in silence while prosecutors walked through Daniel's internet searches, the affair, the insurance policy, and the surveillance footage from the industrial site. Several members of Emily's family quietly wept as photographs of the basement were shown inside the courtroom. For many watching the case unfold nationwide, Daniel Harper had already become the symbol of a man living a carefully constructed lie. Yet, just as investigators believed they finally understood exactly what happened that night, another discovery complicated the case all over again. During forensic analysis of Daniel's recovered messages, detectives uncovered communication between Daniel and an unidentified number active only hours before Emily disappeared. The messages were partially deleted, but one sentence immediately caught investigators' attention. "It has to happen tonight, or everything falls apart." Authorities initially believed the message referred to Daniel alone, but investigators soon realized this wasn't the whole story. The unidentified phone number detectives uncovered during the final stage of the investigation belonged to someone nobody expected. Records traced the messages back to Melissa Carter, a former co-worker Daniel Harper had worked closely with several years earlier before abruptly leaving the company. At first, investigators believed Melissa was simply the woman involved in Daniel's affair. But when detectives reviewed location data from her phone, they discovered something far more disturbing. Melissa's device placed her less than 2 miles from the Harper home during the exact hours Emily disappeared. Detectives immediately reopened portions of the investigation, now considering the possibility that Daniel may not have acted alone. Under pressure from investigators, Melissa eventually admitted she met Daniel that night, though she insisted she arrived only after Emily was already dead. According to her statement, Daniel called her shortly after midnight in a panic, claiming something terrible had happened. She told detectives she found Daniel inside the basement covered in blood, while Emily lay motionless nearby. Melissa claimed Daniel convinced her the death was accidental and begged her to help him protect his children from losing both parents forever. Prosecutors later argued her actions helped conceal evidence, though Melissa denied participating directly in Emily's death itself. But the investigation took one final devastating turn when forensic specialists completed a deeper analysis of Emily Harper's smartwatch data recovered from the hidden compartment in Daniel's garage. Earlier reports suggested the device stopped functioning shortly after the violent confrontation in the basement. However, advanced forensic recovery revealed brief movement and elevated heart rate activity nearly 43 minutes after prosecutors initially believed Emily had died. Detectives now suspected Emily may have still been alive while Daniel and Melissa attempted to cover up the crime scene. The realization changed the emotional weight of the entire case instantly. Prosecutors argued Emily likely suffered a severe head injury during the confrontation, but remained alive for some time afterward without receiving medical help. Instead of calling emergency services, Daniel spent those critical minutes cleaning the basement, moving evidence, and coordinating with Melissa by phone. Emily's parents later described that discovery as more painful than learning about the killing itself. The idea that Emily may have still been conscious, while the people she trusted most focused on protecting themselves, became one of the most haunting details in the entire case. Then came the final revelation investigators had never expected to uncover. While preparing for trial, detectives discovered a voice memo hidden inside Emily Harper's cloud storage account recorded only 2 days before her disappearance. In the recording, Emily sounded frightened but determined. She explained she recently discovered Daniel had been lying about far more than money. According to Emily, Daniel had manipulated multiple people for years while maintaining entirely different versions of himself depending on who he was speaking to. Near the end of the recording, Emily quietly said, "If something happens to me, people need to know I was trying to leave." The recording was played in court during the final week of testimony, leaving several jurors visibly emotional. Daniel Harper was ultimately convicted of murder, financial fraud, and evidence tampering, while Melissa Carter faced charges related to obstruction and assisting in the concealment of evidence. Yet, even after the verdict, many questions remained unanswered. Investigators never fully determined whether Daniel originally intended to kill Emily or whether the confrontation became deadly unexpectedly. Some believed Melissa knew more than she admitted. Others questioned whether evidence may have been removed from the home before police arrived. The case may have been closed, but for many people, the questions never truly disappeared. Because in the end, the story of Emily Harper was never only about murder. It was about trust, manipulation, hidden lives, and the terrifying realization that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of living entire double lives without anyone ever noticing. When Daniel Harper finally stood before the judge for sentencing, nearly 2 years had passed since Emily disappeared from the home she once believed was safe. The courtroom remained silent as prosecutors described the emotional damage left behind not only for Emily's parents, but for the 2 children forced to grow up knowing their mother's final moments had been hidden beneath the same roof where they slept each night. Daniel showed very little emotion as the sentence was read. Several reporters later noted how he stared forward almost expressionless, while Emily's family quietly held each other in the front row. Melissa Carter also received prison time for helping conceal evidence and misleading investigators during the early stages of the case. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered holding photographs of Emily while news cameras captured the emotional reactions from people who had followed the investigation from the beginning. For many across the country, the case became more than just another headline. It became a story about deception hiding inside ordinary lives and how easily appearances can fool entire communities. In the months that followed, Emily Harper's family worked quietly to rebuild what remained of their lives. Friends organized memorial walks in her honor, while local photographers created a scholarship program using Emily's name to support young artists hoping to pursue photography the way she once dreamed of doing herself. The Harper home was eventually sold, though many neighbors admitted they still avoided driving past the property at night. Even after the convictions, theories continued spreading online. Some believed Melissa Carter knew far more than investigators could ever prove. Others questioned whether Daniel had planned the crime much earlier than prosecutors suggested. A few investigators privately admitted they still believed certain pieces of evidence were never recovered. But despite every unanswered question, one reality remained painfully clear. Emily Harper spent her final days trying to escape a man she no longer recognized. A man who spent years carefully presenting himself as someone completely different to the outside world. And perhaps that is what disturbed people most about the case. The realization that evil rarely announces itself openly. Sometimes it hides behind family photographs, ordinary routines, and familiar smiles. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we trust the most. Even after the trial ended and the headlines slowly disappeared, the story of Emily Harper continued haunting the people who followed the case from the very beginning. For many, the hardest part was realizing how ordinary everything looked before the truth finally surfaced. A quiet neighborhood, a smiling family, a husband who stood in front of cameras pretending to search for the woman he already knew would never come home. Cases like this leave behind more than crime scenes and courtroom verdicts. They leave behind questions people continue asking long after the investigation is over. Do you think investigators solved the whole truth about what happened inside the Harper home that night? At what point did you become suspicious of Daniel Harper? And if you were one of their neighbors or friends, would you have trusted him? Stories like Emily's remind us how difficult it can be to truly know what someone is capable of hiding beneath the surface. And sometimes, the most frightening part of these cases is realizing how many warning signs only become obvious after it is already too late. If this story stayed with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because every detail in cases like this often sparks completely different theories from different people watching. And if you think this story was disturbing, the next case might be even more shocking. Subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal the darkest sides of human nature.